The Arab city, architecture and representation, critically engages contemporary architectural and urban production in the Middle East. It takes the Arab city and Islamic architecture as sites of investigation rather than given categories. In the Arab city, Nora Kavi criticizes conservative methods of cultural representation and architecture's misguided attempt to create a collective identity that reaffirms tradition, as opposed to establishing itself as a democratic tool for the growth of a city based on ambivalences, instabilities, and differences.
The book reframes the region's buildings, cities, and landscapes and broadens its architectural and urban canons. Arab cities are multifaceted places and sites of layered historical imaginaries. Defined by regional and territorial economies, they bridge scales of production and political engagement. The essays collected in the book investigate cultural representation, the evolution of historical cities, contemporary architectural practices, emerging urban conditions, and responsive urban imaginaries in the Arab world, and moves beyond reductive notions of identity, myths of authenticity, fetishized traditionalism, or the constructed opposition of tradition and modernity.
The first iteration of the conference took place at the Columbia Global Center Amman in 2013, which began the conversation with colleagues from Jerusalem, Dubai, Beirut, Cairo, and Amman. There, discussions on the work of Yasser El Shishtawi, Bernard Khoury, Senan Abdul Qadir, and others presented many possibilities for further exploration, particularly on questions on representation and identity, citizenship, participation, and conflict. The 2014 conference, which convened in Columbia at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, was an intensive encounter of historical studies and future imaginations for Arab cities from across the campus and the world.
What are the Arab cities? The Arab region is defined by countries in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, ranging from Mauritania in North Africa to the west, going through Lebanon and Palestine on the Mediterranean, all the way to the United Arab Emirates and Qatar in the Arab Gulf to the east. The categories into which the presentation is divided into essentially consists of 1. Cultural representation, 2. The university, academia, and practice, 3. Colonialism, 4. Refugees and boundaries, 5. Globalization and its effects.
Cultural representation. Arab cities are entering an era of historical transformation, leaving a generation in a state of terrifying uncertainty. In this context, practicing and teaching architecture becomes a very challenging task. How can architecture be a medium or practice that widens the field of social and political struggles?
Representation is an active tool made by architects for practice, research, and training that can be used to create new imageries in the future. Architecture can create new shared public spaces, new infrastructure, and also create new spaces and conditions for social justice. Architecture and representation can be used as a method to study the different historical layers of the city and how these brought about changes over a period of time due to the existence of external forces.
Can democracy be practiced only when those who are not represented challenge the image of the society? If democracy is understood as a regime of collective life and whole national character, or identity is the repression of politics and democracy altogether, that implies letting go of the one strong image that would be a nation's identity to embrace multiple identities. Eventually, these would become the new identity, and hence the question remains as to how would one stimulate multiplicity.
University, academia, and practice. In Identity, Authority, and Freedom, The Potentate and the Traveler, a lecture delivered at the University of Cape Town in South Africa in 1991, Edward Said addresses the still very pressing question of academic freedom, the privileges but also the social and political responsibilities of civic institutions like the university, as well as the dangers of the relationship between the university and national identity.
If universities become nationalist political institutions, it essentially puts academic freedom at risk because everything that is taught and practiced is governed by these forces. There is no freedom to explore different ideas and imageries. If universities are to conform to abuse of power, they restrict the students from imagination, excellence, brilliance, and advancement of knowledge.
In the real world outside the academy, we must be ourselves, while inside the academy, we should be able to discover and travel among other selves, other identities. If the model of the migrant traveler were to be assumed for academic freedom, how can one be intellectually and politically engaged with social change and be responsive to abuses of power and still manage to keep a distance between the academic and the real world? Thus, can it be concluded that academic freedom and discourse is always at risk when the university has to adhere and worship national identity?
Colonialism is by definition the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. The Middle East countries were separated by sharp borders and broken into different pieces of land that were colonized by ruling countries at the time. For example, France colonized Lebanon, Algeria, etc. These Middle East cities had a heavy influence of the French on them. These colonies were exploited for the flow of money, oils, arms, and power. Student education had been enclosed upon previously by the colonial intervention of foreign ideas and norms, whereas in the state of building process they were to be remade in the image of the ruling party. For example, after post colonialism in Algeria, the youth were taught in Arabic for the first time and also taught about Algerian culture instead of the French Revolution. Once these cities were decolonized, they were faced with threat of national security and of shaping their own national identity.
Borders and refugees. Arab states were left in a version of sovereignty that's particularly thin and permeable to external forces. The region became the battlefield of proxy wars over control and resources, uprooting millions of people and leaving them displaced in the search of temporary shelter and security. Even though the borders are artificial and porous, when a group of people or refugees cross these, they become invisible of human rights and their identity.
Borders are not just physical manifestations of trenches and fences or lines on a map. They also include other relations and policies such as biometric identification, healthcare, job opportunities, etc. Borders should not only be read as static and fixed conditions but should be dismantling and refabricated to create new imageries of territories. This process could help refugees who are affected by contemporary politics to migrate and move without losing basic human rights.
Globalization. The global context has disrupted the notion of borders. Transferring of ideas is no longer restricted to geographical proximity, and physical borders have become obsolete. Our maps are outdated and no longer respond to our needs. Our borders might still matter in political and economic contexts, but that doesn't prevent citizens to cross them in every direction while still being in one single place. Although there are no borders when it comes to globalization, this appropriation of flow doesn't happen when it comes to several other matters, including refugees, and the limits once drawn in our maps seem to reappear. This is one example that indicates that we are not completely devoted to globalization yet, leading to the conclusion that it is not yet a finished model for us to live by. According to Salah Ben Habib, we are living in a world where the new political forms of globalization are not yet in sight.
While globalization has its constraints, it has allowed for the important issues of representation to be addressed and communicated through ideology, pedagogy, and expression. Nora Akavi herself has accumulated multiple texts and research on the Arab city in an effort to record them as a permanent recollection of the changing situation within the region. In her lecture, she showed how Studio X mapped and documented Aleppo and other cities in Syria before they became unidentifiable due to their destruction, for the possibility of visualizing a future post-turmoil.
Perhaps the discussion on the Arab city invites us only to imagine new paradigms in which the future can be reconstructed in a more truly democratic and inclusive way.